Good evening, everybody. I'm Scott Paul. I am the president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our digital program tonight, Factories on Film. I'm honored to be joined by three distinguished creators and award-winning creators who I will introduce to you shortly. During the next hour, we hope to talk about the role that factories play in both nonfiction and fictional presentations, the role working people play as well. We want to have a lively, interactive conversation. We hope you will participate. There's a couple ways you can do that. One is via social media with the hashtag Factories on Film. Another way is to submit a question via the chat function. And we'll hope to get to some of those at the end of our conversation today. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy what promises to be a lively conversation about factories on film and the working class just ahead of this very special weekend, Labor Day weekend. The artists who I'm presenting today represent, I think, a long line of creators who have celebrated working people in factories. Think about Charlie Chaplin in modern times. You can think about Norma Ray. You can think about American Factory, which won an Oscar last year, the Last Truck documentary, which won a Best Documentary before that. And so The Deer Hunter, there's all sorts of other movies who have factories involved in them, other than, and I will point this out, as abandoned factories where there's a chase scene taking place, which is one of my pet peeves. I like to see them thriving or active or the center of some other type of action, and that's people making things. And when I talk about people making things, it's my pleasure to be joined by Bob Jury, Beth Macy, and Lynn Nottage. I will introduce them each and ask them to talk about the relevant work today. And I will quickly add that all of these creators have produced an incredible body of work that goes beyond factories on film, on the stage, or in literature as well. And we'll start with Bob Jury. Bob is joining us from Iowa City, Iowa, and he is the writer and director of the recent released movie called Working Man. And Bob, why don't you tell our audience a bit about your film and what brought you to that film? And thanks for joining us so much, Bob.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Working Man it's a movie about a career factory worker who continues to go back to his factory job, even though his plant has closed down. And I guess my initial inspiration for writing Working Man came from a newspaper article that my father brought to me. I was living on a farm in southeast Iowa, and it spoke to me because it was a factory that the article was about a factory that there was talk of it opening back up, and it was a factory where my mother had worked as a teenager. And I thought, what if they opened the doors to this factory and discovered someone inside who never had received the memo and still continued working years and years later? And just the idea for Working Man evolved from there. And what you're seeing is the factory itself, where we shot in Norwich, Illinois, a factory that since we filmed the movie in December, it closed down after over 7 decades in production. So it was a bittersweet return just recently. We did a drive-in tour. We've had a drive-in tour across the country of the film, and our last stop was at that factory in Norwich. So I guess relevant is the best adjective I could use when describing just how close to home that this story is to me and to a lot of folks, I think.
Yeah. And Bob, you were, I think, you were able to attract a pretty remarkable cast to this film as well. Billy Brown, Talia Shire, Peter Garrity. I know I had the opportunity to have interviews with all of them about their passion for this project, but it was clear to me that you had an independent film budget, but they were they were incredibly attracted to the vision that you laid out.
We were fortunate, yeah, that for a small indie film to land the talent that we did. Talia was kind of our anchor. Talia Shire, most people would recognize from the Rocky and Godfather films. And Peter Garrity, who I think is somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 credits in television and film to his name, most recently on Sneaky Pete on Amazon, and Ray Donovan on Showtime, but just a career journeyman who in our movie, at least, it was, I think, his first career leading role, 80 years young, getting the opportunity to star in a feature film. And we were really fortunate to have Peter involved. And of course, Billy Brown, who you mentioned, phenomenal actor, just came off a series on ABC called How to Get Away with Murder, opposite Viola Davis, and that incredible cast. So I'm a first-time director, so to have that talent was humbling, to say the least.
A great film that was well reviewed in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and other places as well. And we'll make sure to include links on how our viewers can access that. I want to turn now to Lynn. Lynn, thanks for joining us tonight. You have an incredible body of work as well. You've won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, including for Sweat, which is an amazing working class play that I was lucky to see at the Arena Stage in Washington. And so it was remarkable. But tell us about Sweat and kind of your inspiration for that, and what the major themes were for
sure.
our listeners who aren't familiar. Yeah.
Well, Sweat is a play, and it's really about a close-knit group of steelworkers in Reading, Pennsylvania, who find themselves forced out of a steel factory where most of them have worked over 25 years, and it really examines the way in which their friendships fracture along racial and economic lines when they find themselves in economic hardships and experiencing, experiencing just the difficulties that come with being out of work and being at an age where it's really difficult to find work. And a little bit about the origins of the piece. I've always written plays about working class people, but this play came in a very specific way. I late one night had just gotten back from traveling, and a friend of mine who was one of my closest friends had sent me an email which basically said, I've been out of work for 6 months. I have been kind of ashamed to share that with everybody, but I felt like I'm in such a state that it's necessary for me to let my nearest and dearest know this. And when I read the email, I just burst into tears because I had no idea that she was in such dire straits and that she was as desperate as she was. She was the mother of 2. She was someone who had signed the American contract and who had been a hard worker since I'd known her. In fact, one of the hardest workers I'd ever known. And the next day I called her up and I said, I don't know what to do, but Occupy Wall Street is happening. Why don't we just go down there and figure out what everyone else is doing to cope with this economic downturn? And so we went to Zuccotti Square in Manhattan. We marched around for a full day. And at the end of the day, she said to me, I feel a lot better just knowing that there are other people who are in similar predicament and that folks are really addressing this economic disparity. And from that, I felt like I really needed to begin to understand how this economic downturn was affecting the American narrative. And I went in search of a city which I felt was a microcosm of what was happening in America on a larger scale. And the city that came to my attention via a New York Times article was Reading, Pennsylvania, which in the moment was the poorest city of its size in America. And it was a city that's not far from where I live, which is Brooklyn. It's about 2.5-hour drive. And I went there just expecting that I was going to do a couple of interviews and then come back. And I ended up spending about 2.5 years going back and forth in interviewing as many people as possible, you know, from the mayor, who was the first African-American mayor, you know, through to steel workers. And it was when I sat down with this group of steel workers that I really began to find my play. Through Dean Showers, who was an organizer. He invited me to come to the union headquarters, and these men and women began to tell their stories in a completely uncensored way, and I found myself just drawn into their narratives and felt like I wanted to amplify their voices and help people outside of Reading understand sort of the dire straits that they were in. So that's the origins of Sweat.
It's an incredible story, and a lot to unwrap there. And I can only imagine the. I'm trying to think of the way to put this. I think a lot of working people just want their stories to be heard,
Yes.
Uncritically, and it's something. And you gave a voice to that, both obviously through your interviews with them, but also through your amazing work. And thank you for that. We'll talk more about Sweat in the conversation as well. And I agree with you. Dean is an amazing guy, and we're lucky to have him. Have his talents on board at AAM right now. And Beth Macy. Beth, we have on to talk about a couple of her nonfiction books. The first of which was Factory Man. The second of which was Dope Sick, which in a lot of ways is a generalized sequel to Deindustrialization, focused on the opioid crisis and the economic and health crisis in rural America as well. But Beth, while yours is a work of nonfiction, the John Bassett III, the factory owner, is a larger than life kind of fictional character, and again, your story is very much centered around the factory and the people in it. But why don't you tell our listeners a bit about Factory Man?
Sure. Factory Man was my first book. It came out in 2014. And I was just about to turn 50. I was a longtime newspaper reporter. And somebody had written a story for our paper about this factory that was closing down in Martinsville, VA. And I set off as a newspaper project to tell the story of what happens when a community, which had mostly had all of its eggs in two baskets, and that was furniture and textile mills, what happens to one community when the jobs are offshored? And not just those jobs, but a lot of the ancillary businesses like mom and pop shops and restaurants also closed. And all told, half of the jobs had gone away. And so I really set out to answer that question, first of all, like, so, you know, highest unemployment rate in the state, food stamps had tripled, disability rates had gone up something like 64% just since China had joined the WTO. And as I was starting to research it, I heard about this guy, John Bassett III, who had done something in another community that no one else had done in his industry. And he had started out in the initial community of Bassett, Virginia, with Bassett Furniture. But after a family feud, he ended up landing in Galax, Virginia, running a company called Vaughn Bassett. And when I first heard about him, he did sound Faulknerian. I mean, he just is this larger than life character. And when I said to my friend that told me that not only was he a character, but he had sued China or petitioned the government to prove that the Chinese were dumping or illegally selling their products in American market for less than even the cost of the goods to make it. I thought, well, who does that from tiny Galax, Virginia? And I had to go meet him, and he was indeed larger than life. And so I wrote the book. It grew out of the newspaper series, but I wanted to tell sort of the history of factory work in our country. I was the daughter of a dislocated worker myself in an airplane light factory in my little town in Ohio that would close, and when or my mom would get laid off, and when that would happen, she would pick up under the table work, babysitting and waitressing, just like many of the people that I interviewed. So I have this through line of this kind of fascinating but flawed hero. I have the history of the folks, as well as this legal case that mostly took place in Washington. And then what happened to the people left behind, which was really, I felt like was the beating heart of the book. And if I could stay true to that and to my own roots, that I could end up with a book told in plain language with a really good story that also I could give to someone like my octogenarian mother, who never really understood why it was her town looks the way it does now. And so Dope Sick was actually my third book that sort of grew out of Factory Man. And it's the story of how the opioid crisis landed in this country. And I say it grew out of Factory Man because at the end of my research in 2013, you started seeing abandoned plants being burned down. And the news stories always just said that, oh, that's because, you know, folks are ripping out copper wiring to resell on the black market. But what the stories didn't say was that a lot of them were doing it so as to avoid the withdrawal of opioids, to not be dope sick. And so I took that story back to its origins with the movement to make pain a fifth vital sign and the introduction of OxyContin. And I tell that story through the people left behind from that journey, mostly in Appalachia, coal mining region, where a lot of the jobs had gone, into its present day, the state of the epidemic, you know, the worst drug epidemic in history, and its shift to heroin and now fentanyl, and about the people who are fighting back against that.
Yeah, and Beth, I would be remiss if I didn't congratulate you for, I think this was first reported in June, that Dope Sick is going to be made into a Hulu series, a series on Hulu with Michael Keaton, and I think Barry Levinson is...
Yeah, he's directing, and Danny Strong is the showrunner and creator, and so I got to be in a writer's room for the first time and get a little taste of what Bob and Lynn do. It's a fictionalized series, but it's got a combination of real life characters from my book and from other research that we've done, as well as, you know, folks made up composites. Yeah,
which is fabulous. So let me ask each of you a question, because you know, a factory plays a central role in all of your works of art. Lynn, in your case, it's obviously off screen, and the conversations, I think, mostly or almost exclusively take place in the bar.
Yes.
But the workers might have been coming from the factory or their homes or going to, and it's obviously like a Leviathan or a big backdrop to it. And Beth, in your case, it's about a CEO who wants to keep the jobs in America and is fighting for all of these workers who this is probably going to be their best opportunity that they have in a city, in a community like Galax, and these are good jobs in Galax. And Bob, in your case, in a real world meets fiction meets real world, your fictional factory, you know, the bosses are closing it down. The workers want to keep it open and fill the orders. But I wanted to just ask all of you how important you think that is, because look, let's face it. I mean, most Americans, you know, if you would have asked 50 years ago, almost every American would have had one connection to a factory. They worked in it. their spouse worked in it, their dad worked. I mean, because almost 50% of Americans did work in factories back in the 1950s. Today, it's a small fraction of that. I mean, and it's still declining. And as I mentioned, most of the times you see a factory depicted, again, it's in a chase scene with lots of chains and dripping water and screeching tires and guns. And so it's refreshing to have conversations that are about factories. And so, Bob, what's the role that the physical factory plays for you in your piece in Working Man?
Well, I think in Working Man's case, it was critical. In fact, it's probably another character in the film. We knew initially when we were starting to scout for the movie that without that authenticity, a factory that was operational, I think people can sniff and smell that out when they're watching or seeing something that isn't real, doesn't feel real in a film. The factory we're in, as I mentioned before, had been around for 70 plus years. So, that's a lot of people that came in and out of those doors. I think you can't diminish how important it is to a community and that connection to a place of work. I know that the factory we shot in had started, and the plant manager we worked with, when he had started at that factory, there was well over 200 workers in that factory. At the time that we shot there, it had been reduced to somewhere in the neighborhood of, I know it was well under 100. And when I visited last, it was down to a handful, skeleton crew. So as far as the importance of being in that space and being with the people who were actually working there, who often served in the background, it was critical, at least to our story.
Yeah. And Lynn, in Sweat, you don't necessarily see the factory, but the drama and the circumstances there, it seems to me, play a central role in kind of what the conversations that a lot of the actors have on stage.
Yeah, indeed, like Bob, I think that the factory is the central character in Sweat. And one of the tasks that I had is, how do you bring a place that is by and large off stage onto the stage in a way that feels very vital, alive, and visceral. And I really, when I was writing the play, wanted to take the audience through a journey where they feel what it is to be in the factory with people who are deeply invested in that space. Then over the course of the play, they understand what it is to lose that connection to that critical space, and this, which in many senses is the heartbeat of the community that's at the center of Sweat.
Yeah. Beth, let me ask you, because Galax, Virginia is a small community, and that factory plays a pretty big role in the economy. So what was it like to kind of spend a lot of time in Galax, talking to both JB3, the people in the community, about the effort to keep that factory up and running, and kind of its importance, its lifeblood, really, for the community and the families there?
Yeah, and like you guys, I sort of saw the factory as a giant sort of a physical manifestation of my main character and what he was doing, whether it be in the finishing room, or certain things he had done to increase production, or certain people that he had sometimes tricked into upping their production, and that kind of thing. The people in Galax were kind of matter of fact about the factory, because it's still operating. It's still the largest employer. And in fact, their business is up in the wake of the pandemic because housing starts are up, and they make bedroom furniture. I should have said that earlier. So people are buying houses and buying more furniture. The place where the factory became almost more haunting to me was the places where the factories have shut down. And so the people in Galax were maybe not as interested in, I mean, clearly it was important to them. There were some families, their entire family worked at the factory. But what you saw by the absence of that back in Bassett, where all the factories had shut down, 6 factories all along this one Smith River that runs through it. What you saw and you heard from those folks, to me, was it was so visceral almost. I remember interviewing one woman who had worked at in the office at a plant, and she had a necklace on, and I just said, I really like that necklace. And she said it was a Tiffany necklace from when she had been an office manager. And what she had been doing now is she wasn't picky. I met her, she was working part-time as a receptionist. And she was still really proud of this necklace she had earned when she made good wages. And she had picked up side jobs, as I said before, working for a catering company. And one night at a party she was helping cater, the CEO of her former factory came in. And she said, Mr. Frank, if Toltecs were to open back up today, and the only way I could get there would be to crawl on my belly like a snake, I would do it. And, just literally, it still makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck, just to have this physical manifestation of loss and what it means to a family's history and connection.
Yeah. Visceral, really, really visceral. Let me ask Beth this, and then I'll ask others to join in, because all of you have taken your works on the road and shared them with broad audiences. So in Lynn's case, it's not just Washington or Broadway, or in Beth's case, it's not just cosmopolitan bookstores or Bob's, just like independent movie theaters in major metropolitan areas. You've taken your works out to the people. Beth, in your reporting for Dopesick, and then in the conversations that you've had in all of these communities, I mean, what are people saying about kind of the truths that you were writing, both about this effort, which seemed very quixotic to save this factory, but then where the factories disappeared, what kind of devastation has popped up, and that combination of both opioids and economic despair. But what if, I mean, you must be like a therapist to a lot.
I need a therapist.
A lot of people, and you as well. But to a lot of people who need to have this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. It was really hard, especially with Dopesick, hearing. I mean, both books are about loss in some extent, but it's so moving to be able to give a voice to that. Like the people in Bassett were just thrilled. Like they were just honored and shocked that anybody wanted to hear their story. Like Lynn said of Renning, nobody had ever asked their story. They had done these little news bits here and there every time a factory closed, but nobody ever tallied it and went back and said how many, what the true losses were. With Dopesick, probably the most moving thing anybody has ever said to me is that I didn't understand I was part of a bigger story until I read your book and learned that, this one company followed by others in their footsteps had, sort of flipped the narrative that opioids were unsafe. And now we have 500,000 Americans dead, right? As a offshoot of that. And she said, I never knew I was part of a bigger story till I read your book. Before that, I thought I was just an F up. Mm-hmm. And so that's a really, you have all these kind of quiet looming forces outside happening to all of the folks in our work, and to have them understand it, recognize that they've been victimized by greedy corporations and a lack of regulation in our government, and to give voice to that is really powerful.
Yeah, indeed. And it seems to me, particularly in some of these communities, that they must seem this is all happening in isolation, that both the factory closures or the substance abuse disorders and the availability of opioids and all of this, is that they must feel very alone in this fight. But there's a lot of, I mean, this took place in, I mean, literally tens of thousands of communities around America. And I think you've been able to focus on some of those, but I think that's very relatable. And when I've talked to people about all of your works, it's, I mean, one of the things, particularly that working people say, is that it really speaks to them in different ways. And Lynn, I'll talk to you about that
Sure.
In a second, but perhaps let's run a brief clip of the studio theater when they took Sweat on the road to a lot of industrial communities. Why don't we watch that for a little over a minute, then we'll come back to you if that's okay.
It was actually the Public Theater.
The Public Theater, I'm so sorry. Yes, the studio theater is also in Washington, D.C.
But this Public's in New York, yeah.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Yeah.
If you look at some of the inside, the conditions of some of these places, the stuff that people have to endure and it's terrible. Most of the people that will be here tonight have never been to a play.
I seen the part where he played, as like when the drugs set in.
You need to pull yourself together. This bullshit's got to stop.
I'm trying. Don't give me that look. I'm trying, okay? I'm trying.
Being on the other side and falling victim to drug addiction. I have a daughter in Rutgers University right now. I remember she used to tell me, like, Dad, I love you. Where's my dad?
Tonight made me know how angry I was when I was out of work. And it's bad when you're mad and angry and don't know who to take it out on. You don't never know what you had till it get taken from you.
And they were going to take us and remove us to what is going to be now known as Minnesota. It was called the Indian Removal Act, and it was kind of the Ojibwe Trail of Tears. The people in Hayward, the people in Hurley, these are communities that rose up and fought with the Ojibways to keep them here. We're in this together.
Wow. So Lynn, that was obviously a clip of the Public Theater, and why don't you talk a bit about that tour and what some of the feedback and the other conversations were that occurred around it? Yeah.
Sure. It was actually an extraordinary experience to be able to bring Sweat to communities in the Rust Belt. And it really came out of our desire to be in conversation with communities. And it was always embedded in what I wanted to do with the play. When I first went to Reading, I realized that I didn't want to just be one of these carpetbaggers who poaches stories from the community, then disappears into New York City. I felt it was really important that once I completed the play, in some way I raise money and bring it back. And the Sweat Tour came out of our first engagement with Reading, Pennsylvania. After we closed the show in New York City, the next day we got on a bus at 6 a.m. and we took the show down to Reading, Pennsylvania, and we performed for 500 people. And that experience really led us to this more expanded tour. We hadn't anticipated the response that we got. Some of the actors were actually physically shaking when they're on the stage because they were afraid that the audience wasn't going to necessarily respond to their portrayals of the particular characters. But at the end of the performance, people rose to their feet and they applauded. And then something extraordinary happened. People began asking questions. And then once they stopped asking questions, people began sharing stories and testifying. And it became like this church revival tent in which people shared what was happening to them. And suddenly this community that had been kind of reticent opened up, and people, it's like what Beth said, is that they recognized that there were others in a similar predicament, and it really helped alleviate some of their pain. And so subsequently, we decided that we wanted to do this on a much more expanded scale. And so we decided to take the Sweat Mobile Tour to five states on the Rust Belt, to 17 cities and towns. The majority of these places were towns or cities that did not have regional theaters, that did not necessarily have a theater tradition. We brought the play into non-traditional spaces like churches and libraries and gymnasiums. And by and large, people were incredibly responsive. It's what you see in the clip is I think that people really recognized themselves in ways that we hadn't anticipated. So it was actually quite a beautiful experience. I remember one woman in Reading, after we did the piece, she said that she loved that we centered working people, because she says too often you don't get to see yourself played with dignity. And she said, you know, folks forget just how difficult it is to get up from 9 to 5 and work, but it's at the core of what most of us do, but you don't see that.
Yeah, so true. To the extent that you watch things on stage or on screen or in popular culture, yeah, you think of crime detectives who are probably overrepresented, and professions like that, or tech gurus or whatever. But portrayals of working class people, I feel like that there's a hunger there, particularly for working class people to be able to identify that. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think about, I come from a long line of working people, and one of my artistic missions is to put extraordinary, ordinary people on stage, because, you know, that's my roots. And I, you know, as a Black woman, I very rarely get to see Black working people on the screen. You know, so often when folks refer to working people, it's sort of code word for white people. But the reality is, you know, that Black and Latinx people have been sort of at the core of the working class movements, you know, since you know, America disrupted its original people.
yeah, absolutely. And I want to get to a deeper exploration of that. In a minute, we'll get back to that. But Bob, let me ask you, because you're fresh off the road. Why don't you tell folks about your drive-in tour and what the response was to the film in some of these industrial communities?
Sure. So similar to Lynn's experience, we did a tour through the Rust Belt. In our case, it was drive-in theaters. COVID, of course, has limited the ability to show the movie in indoor theaters. So we went outside. And while you wouldn't always necessarily be able to interact in the same way that you might in a theater experience in normal days, or what we had after, say, a Q&A on the film festival circuit, where you'd have that opportunity to visit with folks after the film and the story, and you'd have particular people that would connect with something in the story, or whether they had similar working experiences. And there's also a large strain that's a spine throughout our movie that deals with mental health. But I can say there was one night that we had off on the tour where we just went to a campground, but we decided to go ahead and project the movie on a kind of a makeshift. We had a screen and a small projector, and there were two people in the campsite who took us up on our offer to come see the movie. And they just happened to be factory workers themselves from the Youngstown, Ohio area.
Oh, wow.
Mother-daughter. And the mother, after the film was over, they were really quiet. And the mother said, you know, I was the last worker to leave a large plant in Youngstown on the day of its closure. And she felt like the movie really spoke to her, and her daughter, who was able to find work, said, you know, there's a second part after your movie ends, right? It's those days and those weeks after a closure, which directly relates to what Lynn and Beth's work is about, that the addiction, the depression, those things that are tied into the aftermath of a closure. But you know, that was an extraordinary experience for us, and a part of our journey was in a time that we felt like was maybe going to be the least revealing, we found two people who were profoundly affected by factory closure and related so deeply to the story, and that was powerful, it was meaningful.
Yeah. And Bob, just to thank you for sharing that. Just a quick follow up, because I know you ended up filming, or you ended up screening the movie on the side of the factory in which you filmed it, in Norwich, Illinois. And you could, I think you've shared a bit of it, but why don't you share it again, kind of like what happened to that factory and why this was really, this had to be really kind of emotional and and just pretty remarkable to be back there under those circumstances.
So the last day of our drive-in tour, we hadn't really planned this initially, but then we started to think there was, as we were coming back across the Midwest, headed west to my home in Iowa City, Chicago was on the route, and it just seemed very fitting that we maybe have the final screening there at the factory. We knew the workers were gone, but it just seemed that was the fitting end. So we with the same little projector, projected the movie up against the side of the factory, a factory which now will be completely demolished. We learned by November. So it was, very bittersweet. Very bittersweet we of course had great appreciation for all the folks there at the facility, McRae Manufacturing in Norwich, and all the work they did for us, and you're seeing images of it there now inside. And but to go back and see this place and project the film as on its leg or tour, it was special, it was meaningful.
Yeah. So one more kind of thread of questions for all of you, and then we have some questions rolling in from our audience that I think are very interesting. Obviously, outside of kind of factory work and factory closures, there's lots of other social issues that are wrapped into your works. I mean, Bob, you mentioned obviously mental health and just kind of like worker power against corporate greed, and in Beth's case, there's so many issues, but one of which is obviously the social, emotional, and health consequences of deindustrializations in communities that are left behind and forgotten. And Lynn, obviously the tension of the lockout and the challenges with the company, I think dislodged a lot of tension among the workers, some around race as well. And I'm wondering if maybe we'll start with Lynn, if you can speak to some of that.
I'm sure. The way that I can speak to it is just my experience of being in Reading, Pennsylvania, and listening to people talk around some of the issues. And one of the main issues was the way in which that city was fractured around racial lines. As we know, so often when factories are downsizing or people locked out, often the first people that lose their jobs are people of color. They're Black, they're Latino, they're easily displaced and they're quickly disappeared, and they're the most hard hit and the least recognized. And I found that certainly to be true in Reading, Pennsylvania. And one of my frustrations is that I found it was really difficult for people to talk about those issues in a way that was open and honest, that I really had to probe people and go deep. And one of the phrases that I really cling to is sustain the complexity, is that often people want to look at things as if they're black and white, but often they are gray, and they're more complicated than they seem to be on the surface. And I think that in the, the economic fracturing of America, the hidden conversation that we're not having is the way in which Black and Latinx people are disproportionately impacted. And that's some of the themes that I wanted to explore in Sweat, is just the way those fractures disrupt friendships and disrupt working relationships. Mm. And yeah, and one of the things that I wanted to do, and which if we have time I'll talk about, is that after Sweat and after the Sweat mobile tour, I felt like I was not finished with my engagement with Reading, Pennsylvania. And I did something called This Is Reading, which was really designed to bring a city that I felt was very divided into conversation. And we built this massive performance installation, which we said we wanted to bring people into dialogue, from, the mayor to the homeless folks, and both recognize that they have the same narrative. And one of the things that we wanted to do was collaborate with the city and figure out, well, what is the story you want to tell? And one of the things that we heard back repeatedly is we don't want to focus on the negativity. We want to focus on our resilience. We want a piece of art that is beautiful, that is optimistic, that really is about shining a brighter light on our town. And that's what we endeavor to do. And so after writing Sweat, performing Sweat, I felt like it wasn't finished until I created this final performance piece, which was about addressing some of these unspoken issues.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Lynn. Beth, let me ask you the same question, just about, and maybe I'll frame it this way because you brought this to my attention. There was a really well-written op-ed in the New York Times just the other day about how the uneducated, the working class, like that's the last acceptable prejudice in the United States. And you've spent many hours in conversations with working class people, both in the course of Factory Man, your own reporting, and Dope Sick. And can you share some of that, just how that's manifested?
Sure. One of the things I think about when I'm trying to explain kind of these complex stories that happen over a long period of time, it's like the slow moving target that you're aiming at. I mean, I'm still reporting on solutions to the opioid crisis, is I like to go back to the very genesis, whether it's the China joining the WTO, or whether it's the fact that Bassett in 1902 took furniture making from Western New York and Michigan because they had people wanting to join, sharecroppers and former slaves wanting to join the cash economy, and said, hey, we'll pay you less, not give you benefits, give you the worst working conditions, and in that way we'll make an even larger profit. So I like to tell these stories through people, but also kind of through these historical business trends as well. And what I was thinking of as Lynn was talking was just about how, Big Pharma targeted the locations where the jobs were going away. And they did that by buying the data that showed them which doctors were already prescribing competing opioids. And then they told their reps, they hired an army of reps, and they told them to go after those doctors and say, hey, the FDA allows us to say that our drug is safer and works better than your competing opioids. And so why you saw the opioid crisis first take hold in West Virginia and rural Virginia and Kentucky and rural Maine was because, not because these places were poor or they were full of working class, but because these companies specifically targeted them at places with low workforce participation, high Medicaid rates. And I just think it's important that we're always looking at the costs and holding as much as we can these companies and these impotent government regulators who really didn't do their job, and the politicians who look the other way, paid by lobbyists funded by these corporations to really hold power accountable.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Beth. But Bob, let me ask you, in your work, because your cast is diverse and your workforce is diverse for a factory. I mean, it's not just kind of like the stereotypical, angry white man. And so what is, it seemed to me that you were trying to frame the workers as having some class solidarity. They all had different personalities and they brought different things into it. And they were kind of like fighting against the man a little bit, the company that kind of owned the factory. But why don't you talk about a bit about kind of the struggles that were contained within your work?
Well, as far as the cast was concerned, we had a great diverse cast, and I thought from the very get-go that was going to be important because as Beth and Lynn noted, it's factory work is pretty universal and doesn't know color. It just seemed it would be dismissive to not paint a real portrait of the people that populate the manufacturing sector. I mean, we were seeing, as we did our tour this past couple of weeks, going through some industrial areas like Youngstown, like Akron, parts of Cleveland, other parts of the upper Midwest. It's easy to see that these neighborhoods that are tucked around these both existing and closed factories are pretty diverse. So at least from working man's standpoint, we really felt like from the very beginning it was important to show that as with a diversified cast.
Okay, so we have a lot of great questions that have come in from the audience, and thank you so much. Keep them coming. A couple of these we can take care of very quickly. First, for you, Bob, where can someone see Working Man? Is it available on Netflix, Amazon Prime, YouTube? Where can they find it?
We're a movie that's on demand right now. It's Prime Video, Amazon, most major streaming services.
Like Apple TV, YouTube, Google,
Sure.
all of those. Okay,
Sure.
Great. So it's just widely available on streaming or on demand.
It is. Yes.
That's great. And again, I highly recommend it. I showed my 12-year-old boys it, and they were deeply engaged, almost as much as Spinal Tap, which we talked about off camera. But they
That's
got
saying something
out of the movie as well. And then another viewer wanted to know how they could connect with us. And I know that I have all of your Twitter handles. We've been sharing those. And so we'll make sure that our audience gets the Twitter handles of everybody engaged here to keep the conversation going. But I know that you're all on Twitter in various ways, shapes and forms. Here's a question I think for all of you, because I think, Lynn, in your work, there is definitely a union. And that is a major aspect of this. Correct me if I'm wrong, Beth, but I don't think there was not a union at any of JB3's factories.
No, Virginia's a right to work state.
Yeah, right. And Bob, in your case, it's kind of I don't think it's addressed necessarily, but there is kind of workers. There certainly is worker voice involved in kind of getting the factory started again. I guess I wanted to speak to that a little bit. I mean, Lynn, for you, for telling that story in Reading, why was it important to have that workers' voice or that union component to it, and to also acknowledge that generated some controversy with respect to the lockout and people, dividing against each other as well?
Well, for me, in many ways, I centered the union because in in some ways, it was my first point of contact and inspiration for the piece. So I felt that it was really essential that it be part of the storytelling. But that said, I also wanted to examine just the complexities of the union fight, that it is, as I said before, that it's not always black and white, that it is gray, is that, you know, the assumption is that the union will always come down on the side of the workers, but they're often at work many intricate things that prevent the union necessarily from fully protecting those workers, which was the case in this particular and this particular piece in Sweat. It's not always the case, but it was the story that I chose to tell in Sweat, that in order to save some jobs that the union was willing to make concessions not everyone was willing to take. And I thought that that kind of tension was interesting to explore, because it built a really interesting dramatic tension between those who are willing to compromise and those who are willing not, and between people all who have this equal investment in that space.
Yeah. And I tell you, Lynn, I mean, in doing this public policy and talking to people, I mean, these are very real struggles that take place all over America, in every industrial facility, because we're in global competition and the demands are extraordinary. And so I think you were able to capture a tension that exists in almost every relationship and workplace today, and do it very well. Beth, how about you? I mean, you know, JB3 is this outsized figure. He does a lot for his workers. I mean, he's kind of, you know, he's not a populist in kind of the working class sense by any means. But how did the workers in Galax feel? Did they feel like their voices were heard?
I think, I know they feel grateful because it is kind of the only game in town. He is, you know, it's his way or the highway. So, and he's virulently anti-union. But one of the things he's proudest of is that he listens to his workers, and he addresses them directly. When this, I don't know if you remember in the book, when this $100 dresser comes on the scene, that is like, there is no way in hell they're not dumping that product here, because he actually had his workers take it apart and they priced out the pieces of the wood that went into it. He called them all together. He had them look at this deconstructed dresser, and he said, you know, we're going to take this on. I'm going to fight for you guys, but I need you to fight for me too. And so, you know, they all had to come up with all these ideas of how they were going to make a more efficient production line, and they did it. And he didn't, unlike a lot of the other companies that joined the petition and ended up getting the duties collected from the Chinese importers. He didn't take that money and close his factory to offset his losses. He poured it directly back into the company and bought some of the finest equipment on the planet that would take the place of some workers, but he didn't get rid of them. He let attrition do the work. And so I think when they saw that he really meant it, and over the course of several years, he did what he said, there was a real affinity there. Yeah. And gratitude.
Yeah, thank you. And Bob, in Working Man, kind of the role that workers' voice plays, because they, to me, it seems like that Peter Garrity's character and Billy Brown's character kind of like are leading, an effort and using kind of savvy PR and other techniques to kind of get that factory back up and running again.
Yeah, it's, again, it goes back to this idea of unity, right? So much of and I think on a larger political sense, what's fractured now in our country, it's this sense of what we can do as individuals to bring us all together. When we were crafting the story and talking about the importance of what this cast might bring and do, that unification idea of what a factory means to a community, what a job means to an individual. I don't think we can overstate the value of that, especially moving into this election year.
Absolutely, and why don't we close with this, because and I'm glad you mentioned that, because there, oftentimes now, if you turn on the television at all, and there's a lot of politics on, of course, but the working class is viewed as a monolith. Lynn, as you very much point out, all of you actually, it's not. It's very diverse, and it's this forgotten man and woman, the angry kind of white man, reactionary kind of stereotype is out there. And of course, there are folks who are like that, but the working class is very, very, very diverse. And so one of the questions that came in is like, what do you think most mainstream media, film, or theater get wrong about the working class? And Beth, maybe we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Lynn and then to Bob. Beth, what do you think that and I know that you follow all of this closely. What do you think folks are getting wrong about the working class?
Well, I know we're really struggling with just how to depict folks in the TV show that we're working on right now in the writer's room. And so we're trying to keep it absolutely as authentic as possible. I was just texting with the showrunner and one of our consultants who is from Harlan, Kentucky, and is a writer named Robert Geit, who keeps us honest. Like if we're gonna, we need to speak like the people speak, and they can't be all perfect and they can't be all evil. They're real beating hearts with different likes and dislikes and ways of speaking and ways of honoring their culture. So I think it's just important to show that in its breadth and in its complexity.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Lynn, how about you?
Yeah, to echo what Beth said. Yeah, I definitely echo what Beth said. I think that people aren't invested in the complexity of the working class, the diversity of the working class. Often you don't see the pride and dignity that people have in working, that somehow what they do is diminished, even though the majority of people in America are technically working class and are working people. So I think that is something you don't often see. And I just think about it, even on the stage and on the film, you don't often see people in the act of working. You see them after they're working, but you don't see people in the factories. You don't see people on the job unless they're cops or they're lawyers or they're white collar workers. So what I think they get wrong is that they're missing this large swath of people who really make up sort of the complexity of who we are in America.
Yeah, thank you so much. And now I'll ask Bob this question, but I'll preface it just by saying, I know when I talked to you during the podcast, said one of the scenes that I really liked in the movie is when they get the factory back up and running, and the injection molding machines are running, and everybody's back in, and there's this gorgeous classical music score to it, like they're creating this symphony of progress and work, and it's a celebration, and it was really profound. I mean, I obviously do this from a policy perspective, but you just don't see it celebrated like that. It was such a wonderful moment.
Thanks. I think that's about dignity, right? And honoring what people do for a living. It's, to me, and going back to inspiration for writing Working Man in the first place, I grew up on a farm. I grew up around and still have friends who are farmers, factory workers, and just, again, that authenticity, knowing what people sound like, how they behave, and something that I've always felt was sorely missing from a lot of television and films that depicted blue collar jobs, working class folks, is the humor, the great humor and intelligence that exists amongst this population that's otherwise ignored, or you spoke to this earlier about how it's so often looked down upon, right? We look down our noses at the uneducated, quote unquote. Some of the brightest, funniest people I've ever met in my life farmers and factory workers.
Yeah. Hear, hear. So, well, hey, Lynn, Beth, Bob, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your time and your talents and your energy tonight. Very grateful to you. And I just want to say the audience has been coming in with a bunch of great reviews for all of you to add to your to add to your accolades. And so we're very appreciative of both the works that you've put before the public and then the time that you've taken tonight to share them with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Great. And I'll just add for our audience, you can keep this conversation going. The hashtag is Factories on Film. You can connect with us at americanmanufacturing.org. All of our guests have recorded wonderful podcasts that are available on our podcast channel online. And I would also be remiss if I didn't say, for those of you who are able to take Labor Day weekend off, pick up a copy of Factory Man and Dope Sick and True Vine while you're at it. Stream Working Man and check out Lynn's plays, and not only Sweat, but her other remarkable works as well. And I can't wait until you're able to bring them to the stage again and we get back up and running. I know you're looking forward to that day as well, because these are celebrations of working people and very realistic, authentic portrayals. And as Bob said, done with a lot of dignity. So thank all of you for that. And I want to thank our audience tonight who's really stuck with us through this, and look for more great programming from us in the future. But thanks again for spending a little time with us. And Lynn, Beth, and Bob, be well and keep up the great work. Thank you so much for celebrating working people.
Bye, everyone. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Scott.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Scott.